For 4 years, he took everything from her name, her voice, her freedom, her brother, even her reflection in the mirror. He was a federal prosecutor, untouchable, powerful, and utterly convinced she would never leave. She left. And somehow, in running from the monster she married, she stumbled onto a bridge in a hurricane and made a split-second decision that placed her inside the most dangerous family in Miami. The man trying to destroy her never imagined she'd find people willing to destroy him first. This is the story of a woman who lost everything and found something far greater on the other side of the darkest water she'd ever crossed. This channel exists for stories like this one, where mafia families protect with a ferocity that polished society never could, where love is earned through action, not words, and where the people who were left with nothing discover they were always worth everything. What Brooke's story gives you: a reminder that the life you deserve is sometimes waiting on the other side of the single most terrifying choice you will ever make. She faced him. She dove in. She survived. If her story moved something in you, like this video, share it with someone who needs it and subscribe. This community was built for people who feel things deeply.
The penthouse on the 42nd floor loomed over the Chicago skyline, a fortress hanging in the night. Windows that stretched from floor to ceiling mirrored the city lights, which created a false sense of glamour and freedom. For Brooke Sinclair, this place had never felt like a home. It was a beautiful prison. She perched on the edge of the master bedroom bed, her fingers laced together tightly, her gaze locked on the clock. 11:43 at night. Preston would arrive any second. His work parties usually ended around this time, and she knew precisely the condition her husband would be in when he walked through the door. Drunk. Not stumbling drunk, but just intoxicated enough to shed the persona of a respected prosecutor and expose the real man underneath. 5 years ago, Brooke had met Preston Hale at a charity event downtown. She was just 23 at the time, a recent physical therapy graduate who was still trying to figure out her path. Preston had seemed like a prince in a perfectly fitted suit. At 33, he was the youngest federal prosecutor in the history of the Chicago office, and he had a smile that could turn winter into spring. He promised he would protect her, that he would handle everything for her. She was naive enough to think that was love. She did not understand that for Preston, protection was the same thing as control. The sound of the private elevator arriving snapped Brooke back to the present. She heard his heavy footsteps on the hardwood floor, the thud of a briefcase being thrown on the couch. Then the bedroom door flew open. Preston was standing there, his tie undone, his eyes bloodshot from whiskey. But it was not the alcohol that made the hairs on Brooke's arms stand up. It was the pile of papers he was holding. Her bank statements. "What was your promise to me, Brooke?" Preston's voice was not loud. In fact, it was quieter than normal. That is what made it so frightening. He never raised his voice when he was truly furious. "You lied. $1,000. Every single month, you sent it to that addict in California." Preston stepped toward her. Each step was like a hammer striking a nail into a coffin. "Keith is my brother. He is trying to get sober. I was just helping him." Brooke never got to finish her sentence. Preston's hand locked around her wrist, twisting it until the agony sent her to her knees. He dragged her to the walk-in closet, threw her inside, and slammed the door. The electronic lock made a final, decisive click. "You will stay in there until I figure out what to do with you." 48 hours. Brooke was locked in that windowless closet for 48 hours. Her only supplies were a bottle of water and a few protein bars the housekeeper slid under the door. She did not cry. She had run out of tears years ago. Instead, she started to form a plan. On the third day, Preston left for a 2-day work trip to Washington. Before he left, he opened the closet and stared at Brooke like she was a broken toy. "When I return, we are going to have a very serious discussion about your future." The door shut. The helicopter on the roof roared to life, and its sound slowly disappeared into the sky. Brooke waited for another hour, just to be sure. Then, she put her plan into action. She cried out that she had a terrible stomachache, writhing on the floor until the housekeeper unlocked the door in a panic. The glass of water the housekeeper gave her was already drugged with 2 sleeping pills. 15 minutes later, the woman was sound asleep on the couch. Brooke did not waste a moment. She went straight to Preston's study, the one place she was never allowed to go. She used a code she had secretly memorized long ago to open a desk drawer. Inside, she found a small black USB drive. She had no idea what it contained. She only knew that Preston protected it as if his life depended on it, and anything that important to him could be her leverage. She hid the USB drive inside a book in her purse, grabbed the cash she had stashed in a box of feminine products under the bathroom sink, and walked into the elevator. As the steel doors closed, Brooke saw her reflection in the mirrored surface. She could hardly recognize the woman looking back. Her face was pale and her eyes were empty, but deep inside them was something she thought she had lost forever: determination. She did not know her destination. She only knew she needed to get as far away as she could before Preston found out she was gone. Brooke did not use an app to call a taxi. She was aware that Preston could track anything linked to her name, from her credit cards to her cell phone. Instead, she walked 7 blocks through the chilly Chicago night until she spotted an old-fashioned yellow cab parked in front of a 3-star hotel. She paid in cash, which meant no questions and no names. The Greyhound bus station on the city's outskirts was her first stop. There, she paid for a ticket to Indianapolis with small bills, and then she found a seat at the very back of the bus. She pulled the bill of her baseball cap down low over her eyes. She did not sleep for the entire 4-hour trip. Every time the bus pulled over to let more people on, her heart tightened as if it were being squeezed by an invisible force. Preston would know she was gone by morning. He would be furious, and with all the power of a federal prosecutor, he could activate the entire system to track her down. Indianapolis welcomed Brooke with a gloomy sunrise and a light, persistent rain that seemed to coat everything. She found her way to a used car dealership on the edge of the city, where old vehicles were lined up like aging animals, hoping for a new owner. She spotted an old Honda CR-V. The silver-gray paint was faded, but its engine sounded solid. The lot's owner was an elderly Mexican man who did not pry when Brooke carefully counted out the bills and laid the cash on his desk. There was no paperwork and no official registration. He just gave her the keys, and just like that, she was on the road again. Brooke did not drive directly south. She knew Preston would expect that. Instead, she headed north into Minnesota, then looped down through Iowa before cutting across Missouri. Every new state was another layer of concealment. Every mile she drove put more distance between her and the monster named Preston Hale. But miles on a map could not make the fear go away. On the long, lonely stretches of highway, every police car that showed up in her rearview mirror caused a wave of panic to rise in her throat. Every set of headlights that followed her for too long felt like Preston's ghost. She ate meals from gas stations, slept in her car in empty Walmart parking lots, and used public restrooms to wash up. She looked like a woman with no home, which was exactly what she wanted. On her second day, in a tiny town in Tennessee, Brooke stopped next to a junkyard. Amid the stacked frames of rusted-out cars, she saw an old sedan that still had its license plate. She switched the plate on her car with the one from the junked vehicle, which was a federal crime. She knew the risk, but when faced with prison or returning to Preston, she chose the crime. Mississippi greeted her with the humid, thick heat of the South and a payphone outside a run-down gas station. Brooke stood there for 10 minutes before she worked up the nerve to pick up the phone. She had memorized the number for the rehab center in California a long time ago. It rang 3 times. Then, a voice she knew came on the line. "Is that you, sis?" Keith sounded much better than the last time she had heard him. Her brother's voice was no longer shaky. It did not have the weary sound of someone battling addiction. "Are you okay?" Brooke fought to keep her own voice from breaking. "I heard you are almost done with the program. Just 2 more weeks. But sis, where are you calling from? This number is weird. Is Preston there?" Brooke squeezed her eyes shut. She wanted to tell Keith everything that had happened over the years of hell, about the locked room, and about her frantic, desperate escape. But she couldn't bring herself to say it. Keith was getting better. He needed calm, not another problem to worry about. "I am going to be fine, Keith. I just needed to hear your voice. But I need you to promise me something." "What is it?" "Do not come looking for me. And if Preston calls you, tell him you know nothing. You have not talked to me. You have no idea where I am. Do you understand me?" A long silence hung between them. Keith finally spoke again, his voice lower and thick with concern. "What did he do to you?" Brooke ended the call before her tears had a chance to fall. She stood there for a few moments, pressing her forehead against the cool phone receiver, making herself breathe deeply until the tightness in her chest loosened. Then, she got back in her car and continued to drive. On day 3, she reached the Florida state line just as the sun was setting, painting the sky a brilliant orange that quickly faded into a deep purple. The car radio kept issuing warnings about a tropical storm approaching the coast near Miami. Officials were advising people to stay off the roads. The coastal highways might be shut down. Brooke knew she should have pulled over, found a cheap motel, and waited out the storm. But her fear of Preston was far worse than her fear of any storm. She drove on, heading south for Miami, straight into the heart of the storm. At 11:30 that night, the Palm Island Bridge appeared through the downpour, looking like a thin ribbon of concrete hanging over a black void. Deep canals flanked both sides of the bridge, the dark water churning into angry waves. The wind howled in ferocious gusts, powerful enough to shake her Honda like a dead leaf. The rain was not falling anymore. It was flying sideways, hitting the windshield like a million tiny pebbles. Brooke gripped the steering wheel with both hands, her eyes straining to see through the sheet of water. She could barely make out anything 30 feet in front of her. This was a bad idea. She knew it was a terrible idea, but turning back was no longer an option. All of a sudden, a pair of headlights cut through the darkness from behind. Brooke glanced in the rearview mirror, and her heart began to hammer against her ribs. 3 black Escalades with tinted windows were approaching fast, driving in a close formation like a presidential motorcade. The first vehicle flashed its high beams. Brooke automatically moved into the right lane to let them pass. The 3 sport utility vehicles flew by her like enormous black ghosts. For just a split second, through the rain-covered window of the middle car, Brooke saw a small figure in the back seat. It was a young woman, her hand resting on the gentle curve of her pregnant belly. The convoy disappeared into the storm ahead. Brooke continued across the bridge, fighting to keep her car from swerving in the violent wind. She had no idea who those people were, and she did not want to know. Her only goal was to get to the other side of this bridge, find a safe place, and make it through the night. But destiny had something else in store for her. 200 meters ahead, the 3 Escalades suddenly hit their brakes. Their taillights blazed red through the rain like the fiery eyes of a devil. From the other direction, a huge truck came barreling toward them. It had no headlights on, it did not honk its horn, it was just a massive shape of metal hurtling through the storm on a deadly course. 3 seconds. That is all it took. Just 3 seconds. But for Brooke, time seemed to slow down, stretching into an eternity. Every single moment was seared into her memory, like a slow-motion scene from a nightmare. In the first second, the truck without headlights smashed directly into the lead Escalade with incredible force. The sound of crunching metal sounded like a giant monster ripping its victim to shreds. The truck's front end hit the side of the sport utility vehicle, sending it spinning 90 degrees. Sparks shot out into the rain like deadly fireworks. In the second, the next Escalade slammed on its brakes, but the wet road made it impossible to control. The vehicle slid sideways, tipped over, and scraped across the pavement on its roof, with the agonizing screech of metal on pavement. A line of sparks followed it for 20 meters, looking like a giant scar cut into the bridge. In the third second, the final escalade, the one with the pregnant woman inside, had no chance to stop. The chain reaction from the crash sent it spinning like an out-of-control toy. The side of the vehicle slammed into the steel guardrail with tremendous force. The rail buckled, and the sport utility vehicle plunged over the side, disappearing into the black, raging canal below. Brooke stomped on the brakes with all her might. The Honda spun 90 degrees and skidded for 30 meters on the slick road. She felt every single foot of the slide as if her own skin was being dragged across the asphalt. The car finally stopped 50 meters from the crash, facing the gaping hole in the guardrail. There was a brief moment of absolute silence, and then all hell broke loose. Doors were flung open. Men began to climb out of the two wrecked Escalades. They were dark shapes that moved with unbelievable speed, even with their injuries. They did not look like typical car crash victims. They wore black suits, expensive shirts, and several of them were holding pistols that shone in the headlights. Brooke realized it instantly. These were not businessmen or government officials. This was the mob. A man's scream in Italian cut through the noise of the storm. Gianna! Gianna! One of the men rushed toward the broken guardrail. He was tall with broad shoulders and moved with the power of a wounded beast. Blood trickled from a gash on his forehead, covering half his face, but he paid it no mind. His eyes were fixed on one thing only, the dark water below. "My sister is down there," he yelled in English, his voice raw with pain. "Let me go, I have to get down there." Two other men grabbed him, trying to hold him back from the edge. "You can't, boss. The current is too strong, you'll drown." "I do not care. That is Gianna. That is my sister." He struggled against them, almost overpowering both of them. His desperate strength was horrifying. Brooke sat motionless in her car, her hands squeezing the steering wheel so hard her knuckles were white. Her heart pounded in her chest. It was not just because of the crash, but because of the horrifying truth of what she was witnessing. This was the mob. These were men who would kill someone without a second thought. If she got involved, if they saw her, if they remembered her face, she would never have a peaceful day again. Every rational thought in her head screamed, "Get out of here now! You are running from your husband. You cannot let anybody know you were on this bridge. This has nothing to do with you." But she could not take her eyes off the man who was yelling into the wind. The agony in his voice connected with a deep hurt inside her. She recognized that kind of pain. She knew the terror of almost losing someone you love. She understood what it felt like to be completely powerless. Just then, a movement caught her eye. The driver's side door of the truck flew open and a man jumped out. But he did not run to help the people he hit. He turned and sprinted in the opposite direction, vanishing into the night like someone who knew exactly what he was doing. Brooke blinked. A normal driver would never run from an accident like this. Not unless it was not an accident. This was a hit. A planned attack. The thought came and went in an instant, because another image had completely taken over her mind. The pregnant woman, the one in the sport utility vehicle that went into the canal. She was trapped down there in the dark, cold water, drowning with her unborn baby. Brooke killed the engine. Her hand moved to the door handle. Logic shrieked at her one last time. "You are crazy. You will be killed. An Olympic swimmer would be afraid of these currents. You are on the run." But a different voice, a quiet one from a hidden part of her soul, whispered back, "A mother and her baby are dying in that water. If you drive away, you will never forgive yourself. You might keep living, but the guilt will eat you alive until you are just an empty shell." Brooke pushed the car door open. The wind and rain hit her with the force of a physical blow, as if the storm itself was challenging her, demanding to know if she was sure. She was. She did not know what good she could do. She did not know if she would even survive. But she knew she could not just sit by and watch another woman die when she might be able to help. For 4 long years, she had been a victim. But not tonight. Tonight, she would be a rescuer. Brooke ran toward the broken guardrail, toward the men were yelling into the black abyss that was swallowing a human life, maybe even two. Brooke pushed past them, past their shouting in Italian, and ran straight to the broken guardrail. She looked over the edge, and her heart seemed to seize up for one horrible moment. 50 feet down, the dark canal churned violently in the storm. The water had no color, just the deep, lightless black of spilled ink that consumed everything. And then, about 100 feet from the shore, a ghostly glow flickered under the surface. It was the headlights of the Escalade, still on, shining up from the depths like the eyes of some beast sinking into the abyss. The vehicle was going down, slowly but surely. Then Brooke saw it, the sight that snatched the air right out of her lungs, a small pale hand thrashing in the dark water. It wasn't waving, it was begging. The pregnant woman was still alive, but she wouldn't be for long. The men around Brooke were scrambling to find a way down to the canal, but the embankment was almost a sheer drop, slick with rain and covered in sharp rocks. One of them had already tried to climb down and slipped, nearly smashing his head on a boulder before the others pulled him back. His expensive leather shoes and tailored suit were never meant for climbing, and definitely not for swimming in a storm. "Who in the hell are you?" A hand grabbed Brooke's shoulder and spun her around. She faced a huge man with a hard expression, his eyes burning with suspicion. "What do you want? Are you with them?" Brooke didn't say a word. She had no time to explain who she was. A woman on the run from a violent husband, trying to vanish from the world, someone who had no real place to go. Instead, her gaze swept over the scene with the practiced eye of a former state-level college swimmer. The bank was steep, but a rock ledge jutted out about 15 feet below. The water looked deep, but she saw no major whirlpools. The distance from that ledge to the sinking SUV was about 80 feet. It would be difficult, but not impossible. In Brooke's mind, an image of her brother Keith flashed like lightning. She saw him on the bathroom floor, his lips blue from an overdose. She had given him CPR for 10 straight minutes until the paramedics came. Keith survived because she did not walk away. He survived because she refused to quit. Brooke ripped off her jacket and dropped it to the ground. Then she kicked off her shoes, her bare feet pressing against the freezing concrete. The man who had been screaming Gianna's name turned, his frantic eyes locking onto Brooke. Blood trickled from a cut on his forehead, staining the side of his face red, but he seemed completely unaware of it. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he yelled, his voice cracking with desperation. Brooke looked him straight in the eye. She had no idea who this man was. She didn't know what he did, who he had hurt, or why someone wanted his sister to die. She only knew one thing. In his bloodshot eyes, she saw the pure agony of a man about to lose the person he loved more than anything. "I'm going to save your sister." And with that, Brooke ran. But she didn't head for the slick slope the men had tried. She ran along the mangled guardrail to a point where the rock ledge was closest to the water, 50 feet above. She had dived from 30 feet in competitions before. This was an extra 20 feet, in a storm, into freezing water, toward a sinking car and a drowning pregnant woman. Logic screamed at her that it was suicide, but Brooke wasn't listening to logic anymore. She jumped. 50 feet of free fall through wind and rain. The world dissolved into a blur of darkness, water, and the shriek of the wind in her ears, as if nature itself was crying out. Then she hit the water. The impact felt like 1,000 needles piercing her skin all at once. It was a brutal cold, so numbing she almost opened her mouth to scream, which would have filled her lungs with water. Brooke sank 10 feet before her survival instincts kicked in. Her legs pumped hard, her arms sliced through the water, and she propelled herself back to the surface. Waves crashed against her, trying to push her toward the rocky bank and away from her goal. But Brooke had been a swimmer. She knew how to read a current. She knew how to move across the water at an angle so the waves couldn't sweep her away. She swam toward the fading glow of the vehicle as it sank, inch by inch, into the darkness. Her lungs started to burn. Her muscles screamed from the cold and the effort, but she kept going. The light got closer. Brooke took a deep breath and dove under the surface. Darkness closed in around her like a black burial shroud. The freezing water put pressure on her ears. She swam toward the headlights, toward the faint outline of the SUV as it tilted further and further down. And that's when she saw her through the side window. A pair of eyes stared right at her. It was the pregnant woman, her eyes wide with terror, but also filled with a flicker of hope. She was awake. She was alive. And she was looking at Brooke as if she were an angel that had just fallen from the sky to rescue her. The Escalade was sinking much faster than Brooke had realized. Underwater, the headlights began to flicker, like they were sending out one last desperate call for help before the battery died completely. Brooke swam to the driver's side door, where Gianna was trapped. Through the window, she could see the young woman trying to push the door open with both hands, but the water pressure on the outside was too strong. The door wouldn't budge. The water was already up to Gianna's chest, and it was rising with every passing second. Brooke put her hand on the window, signaling for Gianna to look at her. She tried to tell her with her eyes, "Stay calm. I'm going to get you out. Do not panic." Gianna nodded, but her eyes were still filled with fear. One of her hands was clutching her swollen stomach, as if trying to protect her unborn baby from the death that was closing in on them. Brooke tried the door handle herself. It was useless. The force of the water held it shut like a giant's fist. She had to think of something, and fast. Every second that passed was another second. Gianna was losing. The back window. Brooke swam around to the rear of the SUV, her lungs now burning from the lack of air. She was right. The crash against the guardrail had shattered the back window, leaving a hole just big enough for someone to slip through. But the opening was lined with jagged pieces of glass, sharp as a shark's teeth, that glittered in the dimming glow of the headlights. Brooke didn't think twice. She pushed herself through the broken window. A shard of glass sliced into her left arm, cutting a deep gash from her elbow to her wrist. She knew she was bleeding. She could see a faint red cloud forming in the water around her. But she felt nothing. Adrenaline was pumping through her veins like electricity, blocking out any sensation her body didn't need to survive. Inside the SUV, the water had risen to Gianna's neck. She was crying, but her tears were lost in the dark water. One hand was still on her belly, while the other was desperately clawing at the seatbelt buckle. It was jammed. Brooke lunged toward her and tried to unlatch the belt. It wouldn't give. The mechanism must have been damaged in the crash. Or maybe the water had shorted out the electrical system. She needed something to cut it. Glass. Brooke turned back to the shattered window and broke off a large shard, big enough to hold firmly in her hand. It was as sharp as a razor. She went back to Gianna and started sawing at the seatbelt with the edge of the glass. And then the headlights went out. Darkness fell instantly, like a heavy black curtain swallowing the entire world. Brooke couldn't see a thing. She could only feel. She felt the tough fabric of the seatbelt under her hand. She felt the back and forth sawing motion. She felt the fibers begin to tear one by one. Finally, the belt snapped. Gianna was free. Brooke grabbed Gianna's wrist and pulled her toward the broken back window. Gianna clung to Brooke like a drowning person clings to their last hope, her nails digging painfully into Brooke's arm. But Brooke held on tight. The two of them squeezed through the opening just as the vehicle tilted completely on its nose and began its final plunge to the bottom of the canal. The current created by the sinking SUV almost pulled them down with it. Brooke kicked with all her might, breaking them free from the suction. And that is when the real fight began. The surface was up there, far above them. Brooke had no idea how long she had been underwater. 3 minutes, 4, maybe even more. Her lungs were on fire. Every single cell in her body was screaming for oxygen, and she was pulling a woman who was 6 months pregnant. Brooke kicked. She locked one arm across Gianna's chest from behind, using her other arm to pull them through the water. It was the life-saving technique she had learned back in college. But learning something in a pool is one thing. Doing it in complete darkness, in freezing water, with lungs that feel like they are about to explode, is something else entirely. Up, she told herself. Up, up. Her legs moved like pistons, her thighs burned, her calves were cramping, but she did not stop. She could not stop. A faint light appeared above them. It was dim, but it was light. The surface. Brooke summoned every last bit of her strength for one final push. And then their heads broke through. The air was cold and heavy with rain, but it was air. Brooke opened her mouth and sucked it into her lungs, her chest heaving, as if she had just been brought back from the dead. Gianna came up with her. She coughed hard, spitting up salt water, but she was breathing. She was alive. But they were not safe yet. The waves were still slamming into them, trying to drag them toward the razor-sharp rocks lining the riverbed. If the current smashed them into those stones, it would be over. Brooke pivoted her body, angling with the flow instead of fighting its overwhelming force. She set her sights on a smooth stretch of stone about 50 feet away. 50 feet. With a woman 6 months pregnant clinging to her back in the middle of a torrential storm, Brooke's body was already failing. After those long moments trapped underwater, her legs started to lock up. First, her left calf seized in a wave of agony, like an invisible fist was squeezing the muscle into knots. Then her right thigh cramped. She fought the urge to scream, knowing that opening her mouth would mean swallowing a lungful of river water. Her arms were turning to lead. She lost all feeling in her fingers. Her body was shutting down piece by piece. 20 more feet. Brooke had no idea where the new surge of power came from. Perhaps it was the memory of Keith, lying still on the bathroom floor all those years ago. Perhaps it was the strength she found surviving 4 years under Preston's thumb. Or maybe it was the glimmer of hope she saw in Gianna's eyes right before she pulled her from the car. Brooke refused to quit. 10 feet. A surge of water slammed her against a boulder, but she twisted at the last second, taking the impact with her own back to shield Gianna. A blast of pain shot through her body. It might have been a broken rib. She could not tell. It did not matter. 5 feet. Brooke's fingers scraped against the flat stone shelf. She found a hold and heaved herself upward. She dragged Gianna with her, one painful inch at a time, until they were both sprawled on the rock. Their legs were still in the rushing water, but their heads were finally above the surface. Brooke gasped for air, her chest burning as if it were being ripped open. When she turned to check on Gianna, her blood ran cold. The woman was completely still. Her eyelids were closed. Her lips had a terrifying bluish tint. Her chest was not moving. She was not breathing. Brooke shut down her thoughts and let her training take over, the instincts drilled into her from her years as a physical therapist. She laid Gianna flat on the smooth part of the ledge, tilted her head back to clear her airway, placed one hand over the other on the center of her chest directly on the breastbone. Then she began. 30 chest compressions, 2 rescue breaths, and repeat. Brooke counted silently, keeping a steady rhythm in her mind. 1, 2, 3, 4. Her arms were already burning with fatigue after that hellish swim, but she pushed onward. 5, 6, 7. Gianna's chest compressed under Brooke's weight and rose again. There was no response. 15, 16, 17. Gianna's lips remained a deathly shade of blue. Her eyes remained shut. Her chest refused to move by itself. 1 minute crawled by. Nothing. Brooke forced 2 breaths into Gianna's lungs, then returned to the compressions. 2 minutes. The rain pelted Brooke's face, stinging like 100 tiny whips. She did not feel it. Her entire world was the count, the steady motion of her hands, and the desperate hope that this woman would somehow open her eyes. 3 minutes. Still nothing. A nagging thought whispered in her mind. She is gone. You could not save her. Just stop. But Brooke was familiar with that voice. 5 years ago, as Keith lay lifeless on the bathroom floor, she had refused to listen to it. She would not listen to it now. 4 minutes. A voice yelled from overhead, slicing through the roar of the storm. Someone was making their way down the treacherous canal wall. Is she okay? Is she breathing? Brooke did not look up. She did not reply. Words were a luxury she could not afford. Breath was a luxury she could not afford. She continued pushing. 28, 29, 30. Breathe. Breathe. Again. 5 minutes. A tremor started in Brooke's hands, born not of the cold, but of pure physical exhaustion. Her muscles had given up long ago. She was now being powered only by sheer determination. But even determination has a limit. 6 minutes. A figure landed on the ledge next to her. She saw mud-caked, high-end leather shoes, black suit pants, completely soaked. Then a face came into her view. It was the man from the bridge. He had climbed all the way down. The rain had diluted the blood from the cut on his forehead, which now traced faint pink trails down his cheek. His eyes were bloodshot, not with tears, but with raw anguish. Please, let me. His voice was hoarse and fractured. You are worn out. I can take over. Brooke shook her head, never breaking the rhythm of the compressions. I know the procedure, she managed to say between gasps. Do not touch her. The man went quiet. He backed away, but did not go far. He knelt on the rock, watching his sister's motionless form, watching a total stranger wrestle her back from the edge of death. 7 minutes. Brooke pushed down with the last fragment of her energy. Her body was about to give out. Her head was light from the lack of air. Her hands were completely numb. And then Gianna coughed. It was just one small, weak cough, but it was real. A torrent of water spewed from her mouth and nose. She instinctively rolled to her side, gagging and sputtering, throwing up a mixture of river water and rain. She was breathing. She was alive. Gianna's eyes fluttered open, hazy and disoriented. Her lips parted, struggling to make a sound. Brooke leaned in closer to hear the faint whisper. My baby. Gianna's voice was barely audible. Is my baby okay? Brooke laid a hand on Gianna's stomach. She was no baby doctor. She did not have an ultrasound. But she felt it. A gentle flutter under her palm. The baby was moving. Alive. You are both alive, Brooke said, unsure if the streaks on her cheeks were from the storm or her own relief. The man scrambled forward and pulled his sister into a desperate embrace, holding her as if she might disappear. He said nothing, but his whole body shuddered with silent sobs. Brooke collapsed onto the stone, too weak to stand, too weak to even kneel. An uncontrollable shiver racked her body from the cold, the exertion, and the inevitable shock that follows when the adrenaline fades. The man finally raised his head and looked at her. For the first time, their gazes locked, clear and direct. No more of the crash's chaos, no more of the rescue's panic. Just two exhausted people, drenched to the bone, meeting eyes in the storm's gray light. His eyes were impossibly deep and dark, but in them Brooke saw something she never expected: gratitude. It was not the casual thanks you give a stranger, but the raw, overwhelming gratitude of someone who had just gotten back the single most important person in his world. He stood and offered her his hand. You need to see a doctor. His voice was quiet and firm. Your arm is cut. Please, come with me. Brooke stared at the hand he held out to her. This was the hand of a criminal, a man from a world of shadows. If she accepted it, she would be entering a life completely foreign to her. But what choice did she really have? Returning to Chicago was not an option. She had nowhere else to turn, and she had just saved the life of this man's sister. Brooke took his hand. Things moved so quickly, Brooke had no time to process them. An ambulance materialized from the shadows as if on command. It was not a standard white emergency vehicle from a city hospital, but an unmarked, sophisticated black van. The back doors swung open, and two medics jumped out with a stretcher and advanced medical gear. They operated with the disciplined efficiency of a military unit, carefully placing Gianna on the stretcher, as an older man with short silver hair immediately started monitoring her vital signs. They had their own private doctor. This family had a personal physician. Brooke just stood there, watching them secure Gianna inside the van. She felt like a complete outsider among these men in dark suits who were working together like a well-oiled machine. This was not her world. She had to get out. Her car was still parked on the bridge. If she could just sneak off while their attention was on Gianna, they might not even see her go. Brooke took one step back, then another, and a third. As she turned to make a run for it, a firm grip clamped down on her elbow from behind. "You are not going anywhere." The voice was quiet and as cold as ice. Brooke spun around to see the man who had stopped her. He was about 50, with neatly combed salt and pepper hair, and a sharp-featured face dominated by eyes that were as unforgiving as daggers. His face offered no warmth, no room for discussion. "You just rescued the boss's sister," he stated, his voice perfectly level. "Did you honestly believe we would let you leave without finding out who you are?" "I am just a passerby," Brooke said, struggling to keep her own voice steady. "I am not involved in whatever this is. I just want my car so I can leave." He stared at her he observed her with the cold, detached interest of a scientist studying a specimen under glass. "You will leave once we understand who you are and why you were there." He then gestured to two large men positioned nearby. They flanked Brooke, moving to her side. While they did not touch her, they stood close enough to send a clear message. Escape was no longer a possibility. 30 minutes later, Brooke was on the deck of a magnificent yacht moored at a private island dock. The vessel was at least 50 meters long, with a sleek design and dark, tinted windows. The interior was a display of polished oak, cream-colored Italian leather, and art she knew was worth more than her entire former apartment. A woman in middle age guided her down to a bedroom on the lower deck. The room was spacious, featuring a double bed made with crisp white linens and a private bathroom with a marble tub. A fresh set of clothes was laid out on the bed, and a tray with a hot meal sat on a table. It was luxurious, comfortable, and undeniably a prison. Brooke saw that the door had no lock on the inside. When she peered into the hallway, a big man stood with his arms crossed over his chest, staring straight ahead. He was not there to offer protection. He was there as her guard. That night, sleep never came for Brooke. She remained by the round porthole, gazing out at Biscayne Bay, where the water had grown calm after the storm. The distant lights of the Miami skyline twinkled like a separate universe, one she could see but could not touch. She had fled from Preston, from the penthouse, and from 4 years of his control and abuse. Now, she was on a mafia yacht, guarded by men even more dangerous than her ex-husband. The sheer irony of it all almost made her laugh. The following morning, the silver-haired doctor from the previous night came to her room. He introduced himself as Webb, just Webb, with no family name. He inspected the wound on Brooke's arm, closing it with 12 precise stitches before dressing it neatly. His movements had the skill of a surgeon who had performed this task 1,000 times. "Gianna and the baby are both doing well," he stated, while putting his instruments away. "She is awake and has been asking for the woman who saved her. You did a remarkable thing, young lady. Very few people could have managed what you did last night." Brooke gave no reply. She did not want accolades. She wanted her freedom. That afternoon, the bedroom door opened, and the man from the bridge entered the room. He was the one who had cried Gianna's name in such desperation, the one who had cradled his sister on the rock in the heart of the storm. But the man who stood before Brooke now was entirely different from that desperate figure. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit, with a white shirt, unbuttoned at the collar. His black hair was combed back neatly. A small bandage covered the stitched wound on his forehead. He appeared more like the chief executive of a billion-dollar company than a mafia boss, but his eyes told the true story. They were cold, calculating, and dangerous. "Who are you?" There was no greeting, no word of thanks, just the question, delivered like a shot. Brooke had braced herself for this confrontation. She had spent the entire night rehearsing what she would say. "My name is Sarah Miller," she said, her voice steady and calm. "I was just on my way to Miami when I saw the accident. I noticed someone needed help, and so I helped, that is all." "It is." The man stared at her without a word for several long moments. He then opened a leather briefcase, removed a file, and tossed it onto the table in front of her. "You are lying." His voice was completely devoid of emotion. Brooke glanced down at the file. The first page showed a picture of her taken from her actual driver's license. Below it was her real name, Brooke Sinclair. On the following page was another photograph of Preston in a suit, standing on the steps of the federal courthouse, wearing the confident smile of a man with immense power. "Your real name is Brooke Sinclair," the man said, his voice as cold as ice, "and your husband is Preston Hale, a federal prosecutor." Brooke stared at the open file on the table, feeling the floor drop out from under her. They had discovered everything. Not just her real name, but also her previous address, her former job, and even her wedding photo with Preston from 5 years ago. In the picture, she was smiling, her face radiant with the hope of a 23-year-old woman who thought she had found her prince. She no longer recognized that person. "Who sent you here?" the man across from her asked. His voice was as flat and even as if he were inquiring about the weather. "No one," Brooke said, fighting to keep her voice from trembling. "I have already told you. I was just passing by." "You are Preston Hale's wife," he interrupted. "A federal prosecutor who is leading a campaign against my family. He has spent the last 2 years trying to put me and everyone I care about in prison. And now, you want me to believe that your appearance on the very night my sister was nearly killed was simply a coincidence." Brooke blinked. Preston was prosecuting this man's family. The realization struck her like a physical blow. In 4 years of marriage, she had never known the specifics of his cases. He never discussed his work at home, and she was never allowed to ask. "I did not know," she said, and this time she was telling the absolute truth. "I did not know what Preston was doing. He never told me anything. He never let me know anything. He never let me do anything." "You expect me to believe," the man cut in, "that a federal prosecutor never mentioned the most significant case of his career to his wife?" "Yes," Brooke nearly screamed, "because he did not consider me his wife. He saw me as his property, something to be controlled, something to show off when he felt like it, and something to break whenever he wanted." A deep silence filled the room. The man with salt and pepper hair, Nico, who stood by the door, raised a single eyebrow. But the man opposite her showed no change in his expression. He continued to look at her as if she were a problem to be solved, not a person sharing the deepest source of her pain. At that moment, something inside Brooke finally shattered. For 4 years she had suffered. For 4 years she had been silent. No one ever believed her. No one ever helped her. And now, after she risked her own life for this man's sister, he still did not believe her. "You want the truth?" Brooke's voice began to tremble, not with fear, but with rage. "Then here it is. For 4 years, my husband made my life a living hell. He dictated everything I ate, everything I wore, and everyone I talked to. He would strike me any time I did something he disapproved of. He once locked me in a room for 2 days because I dared to send my brother some money. I ran away because if I stayed another day, I would have died. Not because he would have killed me, but because I would have taken my own life just to get away from him." She jumped to her feet, the chair screeching backward. "I do not know who you are. I do not know who your sister is. I just saw a pregnant woman who was about to drown, and I jumped in because I could not just stand by and watch another woman die when I could do something to help. If you want to kill me for that, then go ahead. At least that death would have more meaning than dying by Preston's hand. A tense silence descended upon the room. Brooke stood there, her chest heaving, her eyes red but completely dry. She had cried too much over the last 4 years. There were no tears left to shed. The man across from her remained silent. He got up, walked over to the window, and turned his back to her. "Nico, check her neck." The man with the salt and pepper hair moved closer to Brooke. His expression was no longer one of pure suspicion. Something else was there. "Would you please lower your scarf?" Brooke did not understand the reason, but she did as he asked. She pulled down the collar, revealing the skin of her throat and chest. Nico looked, and for the first time, his controlled expression faltered. "There are old bruises," he said to the man at the window. "The pattern is consistent with a man's hand. There is also a faint scar close to her collarbone. This happened more than once." Nico then reached into his jacket and set something on the table. It was a small black USB drive. "We discovered this in your belongings," Nico said. "Do you know what it contains?" Brooke looked at the drive. It was the one she had taken from Preston's locked drawer, the one she thought could be a weapon if she ever needed it. "I do not," she said honestly. "I just knew it was important to Preston. I took it because I thought it might give me some way to protect myself if I needed to." Nico looked toward the man by the window. "It holds proof of bribes Preston Hale took from the Benedetto family." The man turned and walked slowly back to the table. "Benedetto, our rivals. The ones who attempted to murder my sister last night. The wife of the federal prosecutor investigating my family just saved my sister from an assassination plot arranged by my enemies. And she is carrying evidence that could ruin both of them, her husband, and Benedetto." He paused and looked at Brooke, his expression unreadable. "This is either the most elaborate trap I have ever encountered, or it is the most incredible coincidence in history." "I do not know who Benedetto is," Brooke said. "I do not know who you are. I do not know anything. You do not need to," he cut in. "You only need to know that from now on, you will remain here until I figure out how to handle this situation. You are not a prisoner, but you are not a guest. You are a chess piece, Brooke Sinclair, and I have not yet decided on my next move." Brooke watched the man leave the room with Nico right behind him. The door shut with a soft click. She collapsed into the chair, her thoughts a complete whirlwind. She had escaped 4 years of Preston's control and violence. Now, she was caught in a crossfire between two shadowy empires. With a flash drive full of secrets that could bring them both down, she was no longer just Preston's captive. She had become a pawn in a game where she didn't know the rules, and she couldn't tell which player was more dangerous. A week drifted by on the yacht, and Brooke began to mark time with small routines. Breakfast arrived at 7. Dr. Webb came at 10 to change her dressings. Lunch was served at noon, followed by long, endless afternoons staring at the bay from a small porthole window. Dinner came at 7, leading into nights that felt even longer than the days, haunted by nightmares of Preston and the one question that echoed in her mind. Where was he? And when would he find out where she'd gone? Her treatment was strangely kind, which was unsettling. The meals were delicious, her room was kept immaculate, and nobody bothered her. But a guard remained posted outside her door 24 hours a day. She was still a prisoner, just one held in a beautiful cage. On the 8th day, the bedroom door swung open, and Brooke barely recognized the woman who entered. Gianna Caruso looked completely different from the woman Brooke had pulled from the depths of the canal. Her lips were no longer tinged with blue, and her skin had lost that awful pallor from lack of oxygen. She now had a healthy olive complexion, with long black hair neatly brushed and dark eyes that observed Brooke with a mix of curiosity and gratitude. Her 6-month pregnant belly was round and full beneath a flowing cream-colored dress. "So, you are the one who saved me," Gianna said, her voice warm and without the suspicious tone her brother always used. "I have been wanting to meet you for days, but the doctor kept me on bed rest." Brooke was unsure how to respond, so she just gave a small nod. "Are you all right?" I mean, with the baby. Gianna smiled, placing a hand on her stomach. He is healthy, kicking up a storm every night like he is training to be a boxer. The doctor said if you had been just 2 minutes later, he would not have survived. You saved two of us, I hope you know that. Gianna moved to the chair opposite Brooke and sat down, not waiting for an invitation. My brother seems to think you might be a spy, she stated plainly. He sees conspiracies everywhere. It is how he has stayed alive in his world, but I do not believe it. Why not? Brooke asked. Because a spy would have dived into that dark water to save a stranger, Gianna tilted her head, studying her. A spy would have let me drown, then shown up to my family pretending to offer sympathy. That would have been the smart play. What you did, putting your own life on the line for a woman you did not even know. That is either the action of a crazy person or someone with a very good heart. And I am betting on the good heart. They were quiet for a moment. Then Gianna asked, her voice much softer. Tell me about Preston. About everything you have been through. Brooke wanted to say no. She was not accustomed to discussing it. For 4 years she had held it all inside because there was never anyone she could tell, and speaking about it would not have changed her situation. But she saw something in Gianna's eyes that made her open up. Maybe it was the sincerity. Maybe it was because Gianna looked at her not with pity, but with genuine understanding. And so Brooke started talking about Preston, about his sweet promises at the start, how he gradually isolated her from her family and friends, about the bruises he left in places no one could see, about being locked in a room for 48 hours without food, about the night she concluded that death was a better option than staying. Gianna listened patiently without saying a word. When Brooke finally trailed off, Gianna reached out and took her hand. Her hand was small but radiated warmth. My mother was in a similar situation, Gianna said, her voice dropping to a whisper. She tolerated my father for a very long time. In the end, she just could not take it anymore, and she decided to leave when I was 10. She paused, taking a slow, deep breath. But you are different. You made the choice to live. You ran away instead of just giving up. That is what my mother could not do. And because of that, I respect you. Gianna got to her feet, still holding Brooke's hand. I am going to have a talk with Jace. You are not our enemy. You are a friend to this family. And if Preston ever tries to touch you again, he will have to deal with my family. The very next day, Brooke was moved off the yacht and into the main mansion on Star Island. Her new room was 3 times bigger, with large windows that offered a view of the bay and its own private balcony. The guard outside her door was gone. She was still not permitted to leave the island, but she did not feel like a captive anymore. In the weeks that followed, Brooke learned that Gianna had hurt her leg in the accident. It was not a serious injury, but it required physical therapy to heal properly. And as soon as Gianna found out that Brooke had previously worked as a physical therapist, she insisted that Brooke help her. They spent 2 hours together every day. Brooke led her through the recovery exercises, and Gianna performed them while sharing stories about her upbringing in a mafia family. She talked about a cold, withdrawn brother who would nevertheless do anything to keep her safe. She spoke of the baby inside her and about the father who was killed in a hit before he even knew he was about to be a dad. Slowly but surely, Brooke began to feel less like an outsider. Word about the woman who saved Gianna started to circulate through the family. One afternoon, Bruno, the family's second in command, a man with the build of a bear and a face full of scars, showed up at Brooke's door. I heard you can help with back pain, he grumbled. My spine has been giving me trouble for years. The doctors just give me pills. You got a better solution? After that, Brooke started helping more people. They were men with injuries she never asked about, dealing with pain whose sources she did not need to understand. She just helped them, and they started to see her in a new light. By the 3rd month, Brooke was given a phone. Gianna gave her a new one and said she could make a single call, just one. Brooke called Keith. Her brother's voice was strong and confident, more so than she could ever recall. He had finished his rehab program. He had a new job at a center in California that helped other addicts, and he was very worried about her. Preston is searching for you everywhere, Keith told her. He is acting like a man possessed. Where are you? Are you okay? Brooke smiled, a genuine smile for the first time in ages. I am in a safe place. Jace Caruso continued to be a shadowy figure on the fringes of Brooke's new life. She hardly ever saw him. He was perpetually occupied with his work. Nobody ever gave her the details, but sometimes, when she was out in the garden helping Gianna with her physical therapy, she would get the feeling someone was watching her. She would look up to see him standing on the second-floor balcony, observing quietly before he would turn and go back inside. One evening, Brooke was standing alone on her balcony, gazing out at Biscayne Bay as it shimmered under the moonlight. She thought about Preston, the penthouse in Chicago, and 4 years of pure hell. Then she thought about the last 3 months, about Gianna, about the intimidating men who had surprisingly started to treat her like one of their own. And she had a strange realization. She did not feel the need to run anymore. For the very first time, she felt like she belonged somewhere, even if that somewhere was a mafia compound. At that same moment, Brooke stood on her balcony looking over Biscayne Bay and finding a sense of peace, more than 2,000 miles to the north. Preston Hale stood in his Chicago penthouse and felt like he was falling apart. 3 months. Brooke had been gone for 3 months without a single clue as to where she went. Preston had pulled every string he could. He had reviewed security footage all over the city. He had tracked every credit card purchase and bank withdrawal. He had even used his authority as a federal prosecutor to contact police departments in nearby states, claiming to be looking for a key witness. There was nothing. Brooke had vanished as if she had been erased from existence. And the thing that kept Preston up at night was not just that his wife had the nerve to run away. It was what she had taken with her. He noticed the flash drive was gone the first day he returned to an empty bed. That drive contained proof of every bribe he had taken for the last 5 years. It had names, dates, dollar amounts, offshore bank accounts, everything needed to end his career and put him in prison for the rest of his life. Brooke needed to be silenced forever. Preston no longer wanted to get her back. He wanted to guarantee that she would never get the chance to speak a word of what she knew. The break in the case came late one night from a private investigator Preston was paying in cash. Your wife is in Miami, and you are not going to be happy when you hear this. Preston sat bolt upright in his chair. Tell me. She is with the Caruso family. Preston felt as if the wind had been knocked out of him. Caruso? Jace Caruso? The very same mob boss he had spent the last 2 years trying to build a case against. His biggest enemy in the world of organized crime. And now, his wife was inside the man's fortress. How? Preston asked, grinding his teeth. Why? It seems she rescued Caruso's sister from a car wreck. Now she is living in his mansion on Star Island, and they are protecting her like she is one of them. The investigator provided more information, but Preston did not hear any of it. His mind was already racing, forming a new plan. He could not get to Brooke as long as she was under Caruso's protection. He needed someone who could get inside Caruso's territory without raising any red flags. He needed one of Caruso's enemies. A week later, Preston was sitting in a fancy Italian restaurant in Manhattan, across the table from Victor Benedetto, a 60-year-old man with stark white hair and the eyes of a venomous snake, the leader of the Benedetto crime family, and Caruso's bitter rival in a turf war that had spanned decades. What is it you want, counselor? Benedetto asked, his voice a low rumble, like stones shifting. You are the one prosecuting my family, yet you are the one who requested a private meeting. Interesting. Preston slid a photograph of Brooke across the table. Caruso has my wife. I need her back. Benedetto glanced at the picture, then looked back at Preston, a flicker of dark humor in his gaze. I have heard of her, the woman who leaped into the canal to save Jace's sister. Word on the street is all about her. He let out a short, humorless laugh. If we go near her, Caruso will start an all-out war, and I have no desire to fight on another front at the moment. I do not need you to go near her, Preston said carefully. I just need you to provide a distraction so I can get to her. Benedetto leaned his head to one side, listening. Your men will hit the Caruso compound to draw their attention. While they are occupied with your crew, I will use a different entrance to retrieve my wife. Caruso will never know you did anything more than what he already thinks you do. He will write it off as another one of your failed attacks. And what is in this for me? Benedetto asked. He asked. Preston smirked. I am the one in charge of the case against you. I can make that entire file vanish for good. A tense quiet filled the space between them. Benedetto raised his wineglass to his mouth, took a very slow sip, and held his gaze steady on Preston. She is your wife, he finally said, and you have every right to bring her home. I get it. We have an agreement. 2 weeks later in Miami, Gianna came to Brooke's bedroom door, her face glowing with a smile. Her baby bump was more pronounced now, as she was well into her 8th month of pregnancy. This weekend is the christening for Marco's baby. Gianna said, You absolutely have to be there. You are the good luck charm for this family. Everybody is dying to meet the woman who rescued me. Brooke paused. She still felt uneasy in large groups, particularly crowds full of dangerous men, but she could not refuse Gianna. I will be there, Brooke said, managing a smile. That morning, the sky over Miami was a perfect, cloudless blue. Brooke stood looking at her reflection in her bedroom mirror, wearing a dress for the first time since she fled Chicago. It was a simple but beautiful dress in a pale blue shade that Gianna had picked out for her. She stared at the woman in the mirror and could barely recognize herself. The dark circles under her eyes from so many sleepless nights had vanished. The constant look of fear was gone from her face. She appeared calm. She appeared happy. She had no idea that Preston was already making his way to Miami. She did not know that Benedetto had assembled a team, waiting for the signal to attack. She was completely unaware that the real storm was about to hit. The christening took place at an old Catholic church on the mainland, about a 20-minute drive from Star Island. Nearly the entire Caruso family was in attendance, from Jace, who wore a serious black suit, to Bruno, who looked annoyed like a man forced to dress up, along with many other men and women Brooke had slowly gotten to know over the past 3 months. Only Brooke and Gianna stayed behind at the huge house. Gianna was too far along in her pregnancy to move around comfortably, so Brooke offered to stay and keep her company. 4 bodyguards were stationed around the property. Star Island was known as the most secure neighborhood in Miami, with its own private security force and only a single road for access. Nobody imagined anything could go wrong on such a peaceful Sunday. Brooke and Gianna were relaxing in the living room on the first floor, where large glass doors opened up to the swimming pool and the wide expanse of Biscayne Bay. Gianna was excitedly talking about her ideas for decorating the nursery, while Brooke listened with a genuine smile. She had gotten used to these kinds of normal conversations, simple moments she was never allowed to experience during the 4 years she was with Preston. The clock on the wall read 1 o'clock in the afternoon when a loud explosion erupted from the front gate. Brooke jumped to her feet. Then came the sound of gunfire, followed by more gunfire. It was not just 1 or 2 shots, but the rapid sound of automatic weapons tearing through the quiet afternoon air. Brooke rushed over to the window, and it felt like her heart stopped beating. A team of men dressed entirely in black was storming through the ruined entrance. They moved like soldiers, with their guns ready, firing at the 4 bodyguards who were desperately trying to defend the grounds. This was no simple break-in. It was a planned attack. It was an invasion. Gianna ran into the room right after the first shots rang out. The color drained from her face, her eyes wide with terror. What is going on, Benedetto? For some reason, Brooke knew with absolute certainty what was happening. This had to be the rival family that Jace had mentioned to her once. the very same people who tried to harm Gianna on the bridge 3 months ago. We need to leave right now. Brooke grabbed Gianna's hand. Is there any other way out of here? My brother's office, Gianna said, her voice shaking. It has a hidden tunnel that goes to the dock, on the other side of the house. The two women hurried down the long hallway as the sounds of shooting grew louder and closer. Brooke could hear men shouting in Italian, the noise of shattering glass, and the heavy sound of boots on the floor. The attackers were already inside the house. Jace's office was located at the very end of the hall. Gianna rushed to a huge oak bookcase, tugged on a book that was a fake, and the entire unit slid away, showing a solid steel door. You should go first, Brooke urged her. I will be right after you. No, Gianna shook her head firmly. We are going together. You saved my life once. I am not going to leave you behind. Brooke wanted to protest, but there was no time left. She had just taken a step toward the tunnel when the office door flew open with a crash. She spun around, preparing herself to confront the men in black. But the person who walked in was not wearing black. He was dressed in a pricey gray suit with a crisp white shirt. His sandy blonde hair was perfectly combed, and he held a pistol pointed directly at Brooke. It was Preston Hale. Hello, Brooke. Preston's voice dripped with a terrifying sweetness. I have missed you very much. Brooke was frozen in place. Over the last 3 months she had started to push his face, his voice, and the terror he caused her out of her mind. But seeing him now, it all came rushing back, with the force of a tidal wave. Preston stood in the middle of Jace Caruso's office like he owned the place. He took another step into the room, his eyes scanning everything before they landed on Gianna, who was shaking next to the entrance of the tunnel. So, you must be Caruso's sister, Preston said with a chilling smile. The one my wife risked everything to save. How interesting. She is not involved in this. Brooke moved forward, putting her body between Preston and Gianna. Leave. She is pregnant. You cannot touch her. Preston let out a laugh, and the sound was as cold as ice. I do not care about her. I am only here for you. 3 months, Brooke. I looked for you all over, and you were here the whole time, living like a princess in a house full of criminals. It looks like you do not even need me anymore, do you? The gun in Preston's hand rose slightly, now aimed straight at Brooke's heart. Behind her, Gianna shifted her weight. She was getting ready to do something, maybe make a run for it or try to grab a phone. Brooke had no idea, and she was too afraid to turn and see. Do not move, pregnant lady, Preston said, his voice as sharp as a razor's edge. One more move, and I will shoot my wife right here in front of you. Gianna froze. But then, she did something completely unexpected. She suddenly lunged at him, trying to push Preston over with all the force of her 8-month pregnant body. Pregnant body. Preston's reaction was immediate. He shoved her backward. She landed on the hardwood floor with a sickening thud, her hands instinctively flying to protect her stomach as her face twisted in agony. Gianna! Brooke cried out, dropping to her knees beside her friend. Gianna just lay there, fighting for breath, her hands clutching her swollen belly. Preston moved in, grabbed a fistful of Brooke's hair, and jerked her to her feet. A flash of white-hot pain seared her scalp. Brooke fought the urge to scream, biting it back. That is enough, Preston snarled. We are leaving this instant. Wait, Brooke said, keeping her voice steady while her heart hammered against her ribs. I will come with you. I will not fight. Just leave her here. She is 8 months pregnant, and she took a bad fall. She needs a doctor. If you drag me away and she dies, Caruso will hunt you down to the ends of the earth. Preston paused, clearly weighing his options. In that brief moment, Brooke knelt by Gianna one last time, pretending to check on her. As her hand rested on Gianna's shoulder, she slid the Universal Serial bus into the pocket of Gianna's dress. It was the one piece of insurance she had carried with her this entire time. I am counting on you, Brooke whispered, so quietly only Gianna could hear. Then she stood and faced Preston again. Let us go. Preston seized Brooke's arm and pulled her forcefully toward the exit. Gunshots were still echoing from another part of the mansion. They sounded more distant now, a sign that Benedetto's diversion was working. Brooke followed Preston without a single look back. She could hear Gianna call her name, her voice thick with pain and fear. But she did not dare to turn around. If she did, she knew she would lose the resolve to see this through. And if Preston found out the drive was missing, he would go back and kill Gianna without hesitation. Preston dragged Brooke through the garden behind the estate, past the towering palm trees, and across the perfectly manicured lawn. Ahead of them, the gunfire continued its grim rhythm, a clear signal that Benedetto was keeping everyone occupied. The Caruso family's private dock slowly came into view. A white speedboat was waiting, its engine idling, with a man already behind the wheel. This was Preston's escape plan all along. Get inside during the confusion, grab Brooke, and vanish over the water before anyone even knew what happened. Get in the boat. Preston shoved Brooke toward the water as he barked the order. What are you planning to do with me? Brooke asked, her voice a calm mask for the frantic beating of her heart. A smile spread across Preston's face. It was the same smile she had witnessed countless times, the one that always appeared right before he did something terrible. You are going home, back to Chicago, to our penthouse. And this time, I will make certain you never have another chance to escape. You will stay locked in there forever, Brooke, until I say you can leave. Preston's fingers tightened on Brooke's arm. It was the same familiar crushing strength that had dominated her for 4 long years, that had made her cower like a frightened animal. It was the force that had once convinced her she would never be free. But she was no longer that woman. For the last 3 months, she had been alive. Not just surviving, but truly living. She had plunged into dark water to rescue a complete stranger. She had learned to hold her head high and look people in the eye without flinching. She had started to remember the person she was before Preston, a capable woman who knew her own worth. And there was something else. Preston had made her take self-defense classes 2 years before. He claimed it was so she could protect herself when he was not around. The reality was, it was just another method to control her schedule, to know her exact location 3 nights a week. But she had paid attention, and she had not forgotten the lessons. That irony was about to become her salvation. Preston pushed her toward the stairs that led down to the boat. Move it. We do not have all day. Brooke took a couple of steps, and then she appeared to stumble. At least, that is what Preston thought he saw. She pitched forward, landing on one knee on the wooden planks, her hands catching her fall. Preston let out an annoyed sigh and bent over to pull her up. In that instant, Brooke spun around. She drove her elbow directly into Preston's face with all the force she could muster. She felt the crunch of bone against bone. Preston staggered back, his hand flying to his nose as blood gushed between his fingers. The gun he was holding fell from his other hand and clattered on the dock. Brooke dove for it. Her fingers grazed the cold steel. But Preston recovered faster. His foot slammed into her back, pinning her to the wooden deck. Then his full weight came down on top of her, oppressive and cruel. You really think you can fight me? Preston snarled, his face a mask of fury, his own blood smearing his cheek. You think a few months with gangsters has made you some kind of tough girl? His hand closed around Brooke's throat, and he began to squeeze. Brooke could not get any air. Her vision started to tunnel. Dark spots swam in front of her eyes. She could feel her life slipping away with each passing second. Was this really how it was going to end? After all she had been through, to die by Preston's hand on a stranger's dock? No. Brooke's free hand frantically searched the wooden planks. Her fingers found something solid. It was a decorative rock, small but with good weight. She gripped it, and with the last ounce of her strength, she slammed it against the side of Preston's head. Once. His grip on her throat loosened. Twice. He rolled off of her. Brooke scrambled away from him, choking and gasping for air, desperately pulling oxygen back into her starved lungs. Preston was dazed for only a moment. Then he pushed himself up, his eyes glowing with a murderous rage. He spotted the gun, snatched it from the dock, and pointed it directly at Brooke. I already told you. His voice was as cold as ice. You can never beat me. A gunshot exploded in the air, but the sound did not come from Preston's weapon. Preston's body convulsed violently, his eyes growing wide with disbelief. He looked down at his left shoulder, where a dark red stain was spreading across his expensive suit. Then he collapsed, and the gun fell from his limp hand. Brooke turned her head. Standing at the other end of the dock was Jace Caruso, a thin curl of smoke rising from the barrel of the gun he held. He was still in the black suit he wore to the christening, though his shirt was now partially unbuttoned, and a smear of blood was on his wrist. He had fought his way back for her. Jace strode forward, kicked Preston's weapon further away, and then stood over the man moaning on the ground. He lifted his own gun, aiming it squarely at Preston's head. No! Brooke yelled, her voice hoarse from the pressure that had almost ended her life. Do not kill him! Jace did not even glance at her. His gaze remained locked on Preston. He nearly killed you. He invaded my home. He put my sister in danger. Give me a single reason I should not end this right now. Brooke managed to get to her feet, stumbling toward Jace. Because if you kill him now, I will never be free. Her voice was unsteady, but her words were solid. He will be seen as a victim. The world will never know what a monster he truly was. I need him to face a trial. I need everyone to know what he is. I need people to hear my story. That is the only way I can truly leave him behind. Jace remained silent. His finger was still poised on the trigger. Brooke could see the internal battle playing out on his face. The mafia boss in him wanted to eliminate the threat immediately, but something else gave him pause. Then very slowly, Jace lowered his weapon. They heard footsteps behind them. Brooke turned to see Gianna walking toward them, one hand supporting her belly, the other holding a small black object. The Universal Serial Bus Drive. I have it, Gianna said, her voice still shaky from the pain and terror. The proof you gave me. It is more than enough to put him away for the rest of his natural life. She held the drive out to Jace. He looked at it, then back at Brooke, and finally down at Preston, who was still groaning on the dock. All right, Jace said finally. We will handle this your way. Preston Hale will go to trial, and he will spend every last one of his days rotting in a prison cell. The Benedetto assault was over almost as quickly as it had started. Once Jace and his men got back from the church, the attackers knew they had walked directly into a trap. The element of surprise was gone. They were severely outnumbered. Their only remaining option was to retreat. The Caruso family lost two of their own in the exchange. Two men whose wounds Brooke had personally stitched up while they told her stories about their families. She stood and watched as their bodies were carried away, feeling like a piece of this new life she had found had been permanently broken. Preston Hale was tied up and taken down to the mansion's wine cellar. The cellar, filled with priceless vintages and kept at a perfect temperature, now served as a makeshift jail for the federal prosecutor who had once held the city of Chicago in his grip. Jace went down there by himself. He just stood there, watching Preston sitting on the cold floor, his shoulder bandaged from the bullet wound, his eyes filled with a mixture of pure hatred and raw fear. You thought you could just walk into my house? Jace asked, his voice as casual as if he were talking about the weather. You put your hands on my sister, you try to take one of my people, and you thought there would be no consequences? I am a federal prosecutor, Preston snarled through gritted teeth. If you kill me, the Federal Bureau of Investigation will hunt you to the ends of the earth. Jace tilted his head, as if he were considering a business offer. Who said anything about killing you? Some things are much worse than death, Preston Hale, and you are about to learn that firsthand. Later that night, a black sedan with no license plates pulled up to the main gate of the estate. The woman who got out of the car was a petite Asian woman in her 40s, wearing a plain gray suit and practical heels. Her eyes, however, were incredibly sharp, and her movements were precise, signaling she was far from ordinary. This was Special Agent Monica Chen of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. She was the one figure in the entire system Preston could never bribe, driven by a deep-seated hatred for men who hurt their wives. Her expression was cold and triumphant as she gazed at Preston in his wine cellar. "Preston Hale," she stated, "I have been watching you for a very long time. Your case is always closed too neatly. The criminals you put away were always competitors of certain families, but I could never prove it until today." She held up a USB drive and a printed document showing security footage from the mansion. It showed Preston bursting into the office, throwing Gianna down, and then dragging Brooke out. The images were perfectly clear. They were more than enough to destroy his career and his entire life. 3 months later, the trial convened at the federal courthouse in Chicago. The media swarmed the building like birds of prey circling a kill. A celebrated prosecutor exposed as a fraud. A man sworn to uphold the law was now revealed to be a monster. The story was simply too sensational for anyone to pass up. Brooke took the witness stand, dressed in a modest blue dress Gianna had picked out for her. She explained everything that had happened. 4 years of torment, the nights spent locked inside a room, the bruises inflicted where no one could see them, her escape, and the abduction that followed. Her voice remained steady. Her eyes stayed dry. She just recounted the facts, one after another, as if she were delivering a report on a life that belonged to someone else. Keith even flew in from California to give his testimony. Her brother stood before the court, looking healthy and sober, and described how Preston had used him as leverage to manipulate his sister. He spoke of the threats to stop paying for his rehab if Brooke disobeyed, and how the same man had imprisoned them both in separate kinds of cages. The charges against Preston just kept coming. There was bribery involving organized crime, conspiracy with the mafia, domestic violence, kidnapping, assault with intent to do bodily harm, and breaking and entering. Each new charge was like another bar on the cell that would hold Preston Hale for the rest of his days. The sentence was life in prison with no possibility of parole. The judge announced the verdict with the same lack of emotion as someone reading a dinner special. Preston just stood there, his face ashen and his body shaking. He turned for one last look at Brooke before the guards let him out. His eyes burned with intense hatred. But Brooke was not scared any longer. She met his gaze with a look of complete calm. He had lost all his power over her. Brooke stayed in her seat as the courtroom gradually cleared out. She did not weep. She did not smile. She just took a breath. It was the first time in many years that she could breathe without being afraid. Outside the courthouse, Jace Caruso stood waiting by a polished black sedan. He had not attended the trial, as that was not his kind of world, but he had come for her. "Are you okay?" he asked as Brooke emerged. She looked toward the Chicago sky, at the city she once feared would be her final resting place. Now, it was just another city, nothing special. "I am not sure what okay even means now," she answered truthfully. "But I think I can figure it out." One step at a time. Jace gave a slight nod. He pulled open the car door for her without saying another word. Brooke glanced at the car, then to Jace, and then back at the courthouse. She had the freedom to go anywhere she wanted. She was free. For the first time in 5 years, she was completely free. She got into the car, not because she had to, and not because there was no other option, but because it was her choice. 2 years later, during a spring season in Miami, the Star Island estate was radiant under the April sun, decorated with white flowers and silver ribbons that fluttered in the ocean breeze. The sound of classical music drifted from a small orchestra in the garden, mixing with the soft murmur of waves against the distant seawall. It was the day of the christening for Marcus, Gianna's son, the very same child Brooke had rescued from the bottom of a canal while he was still in his mother's womb 2 years prior. Marcus was now almost 2 years old, with his mother's dark eyes and a charming, dimpled smile that had won over the whole family. Brooke was on the second-floor balcony, observing the guests as they arrived in the garden below. She was no longer the desperate woman who had fled across 3 states. She was no longer the outsider who was taken in to repay a debt. She was now Brooke Sinclair, the manager of the Caruso family's legitimate real estate division. This included boutique hotels, upscale restaurants, and rental properties all along the Miami coastline. She handled all the contracts, supervision, and management. It was legitimate business, a stable career, and a life she had never even dared to dream about. She also had her own place, a small penthouse at the island's edge that looked out over Biscayne Bay. It was a birthday present from Jace the previous year. "You ought to have your own space," he had told her when he gave her the keys. "A place that is yours alone, not the family's, not anyone else's. This is your home, Brooke, a real home." A gentle knock at the door pulled Brooke from her thoughts. Gianna came in, looking stunning in a cream-colored dress, holding Marcus, who wiggled in his white christening attire. "Are you ready? They are all waiting for us." Brooke smiled and walked with Gianna down to the garden. A small altar was set up under the branches of a large banyan tree, where a priest in ceremonial vestments was waiting. Familiar people were gathered around. Bruno, with his huge, bear-like build, seemed uncomfortable in a suit, but his gaze softened whenever he saw the baby. Nico was behind him, his hair now completely white, but his posture was still perfectly straight. Dr. Webb was in the front row, a kind smile on his old face, and Keith, Brooke's brother, stood by the family section, looking taller and more vibrant than he had at the trial. He had relocated to Miami 6 months ago and was now employed at a local recovery center, guiding others through the same battle with addiction that he had once fought. The christening ceremony was both dignified and heartfelt. After it concluded, Gianna walked to the front of the altar, with Marcus still in her arms. "I would like to say something," she announced, her voice clear in the quiet atmosphere. "This is my son, Marcus, but his full name is Marcus Brooks Caruso. We gave him his middle name to honor the person who saved both of our lives 2 years ago." Brooke felt a shock, as if she had been physically struck in the chest. She had no idea this was planned. She looked at Gianna, her eyes beginning to well up. "Brooke Sinclair was not a member of our family when she plunged into that dark water that night," Gianna went on. "She was an outsider, a woman on the run with absolutely nothing. She was busy trying to save her own life. She could have just kept on driving, and no one would have ever faulted her for it. But she chose not to. She dived into that cold, dark water to rescue a pregnant woman she did not know. She put her own life on the line for a total stranger. That is not something a stranger does. That is something family does." Gianna looked directly at Brooke, her eyes glistening with tears. "You gave my son a chance to be born. You gave me the gift of being a mother. Now my son will have your name for all of his life to remember that gift." Jace Caruso then came to stand by his sister's side. He held a small black velvet box. "We are not quick to trust people from the outside," Jace said, his voice deep and even. "It is how we have stayed alive in our world. But you showed us you are not an outsider. You showed us not with promises, but with deeds, with your own blood." He opened the box. A brilliant silver bracelet lay inside, exquisitely engraved with the word Familia. "You do not answer to any one of us," Jace declared, looking straight into Brooke's eyes. "You are part of all of us. This is your home, Brooke Sinclair, if you will have it." Brooke moved forward, her legs feeling unsteady. She extended her hand, and Jace clasped the bracelet around her wrist. The silver felt cool on her skin and was a perfect fit, as if it had been custom-made for her. And because it had been, the entire family started to applaud. It was not a loud, chaotic celebration, but a quiet, respectful applause full of warmth. It was the sound of some of Florida's most formidable people welcoming a new person into their circle. Gianna wrapped her arms around Brooke, with a giggling Marcus between them. "Welcome to the family," she whispered. Brooke returned the hug. And finally, she let the tears come. These were not like the tears she had shed in the Chicago penthouse. These were tears of joy. When they let go, Brooke glanced down at the bracelet. Familia. Family. Her thoughts drifted to Preston. To 4 years of misery, the locked door, and the constant fear. Then she surveyed her surroundings. Gianna was beaming, holding Marcus. Keith was close by and gave his sister a quick wink. Bruno was clumsily wiping his eyes, pretending he was not crying. And Jace stood back a little, resting against the banyan tree, observing her with the slightest hint of a smile. For the very first time, Brooke Sinclair knew what it was like to truly belong. Not because she was trapped, not because she had no alternative, but because she wanted to be there, with them, with this family. As night came to Star Island, it brought a kind of beauty that always left Brooke in awe. She was on the mansion's balcony, gazing at Biscayne Bay as it sparkled under the moon, like a spill of countless diamonds on dark water. It was the same water. It was the same bay, too. All those years ago, she had thrown herself into that water to save a total stranger. Tonight, she stood in the same spot, a silver bracelet with the word Familia etched into it cool against her skin. She stared down at the dark waves that had almost claimed both her and Gianna. The sound of quiet footsteps broke her thoughts. Gianna appeared, coming to stand right beside Brooke. In her arms, Marcus was sound asleep, his little head nestled on his mother's shoulder. Gianna asked softly, "What is on your mind?" Brooke kept her gaze on the bay. "I am just thinking, what if I had just kept driving that night? Then you would not be here," Gianna said. Brooke slowly shook her head. "No. If I had not stopped, I would still be running. I would still be scared and completely alone. I might have been alive, but I would not have been living, just surviving, one day after another, waiting for Preston to find me, or just waiting until I was too exhausted to run anymore." Gianna did not say a word. She just stood there with Brooke in the quiet night. Marcus moved a little in his sleep, his lips parting slightly, as if he were having a happy dream. A moment later, another set of footsteps echoed on the balcony. It was Keith, holding a glass of water. "Jace sent me up," he said. "He wanted to know if you were ready to head home. He is waiting for you downstairs." A small smile touched Brooke's lips. "Tell him I will be right down." Keith started to turn away, but then he paused. He looked over at his sister, and Brooke saw a look in his eyes she had never seen before. "You know," he began, "I am so proud of you. You did what I always thought was impossible. You actually got out. You built a life. You did not just survive, you really lived. For the longest time, I thought we were both stuck for good, me with my addiction, and you in that marriage. But seeing you tonight, it makes me believe that anyone can change their own story." Brooke moved toward him and wrapped her arms around her brother. They did not need to say anything. The hug said it all, a silent acknowledgement of the long, hard journey they had both taken to get here. After Keith went inside, Brooke turned back to Gianna. "You know something? I think I finally get it." "Get what?" Gianna asked. "Why I jumped in the water that night." Brooke glanced down at the bracelet on her arm. "It was not because I was brave. I was not brave in the slightest. It was because, in that single moment, I had absolutely nothing left to lose. Everything was already gone. My sense of self, my freedom, any belief I had in myself. Leaping into that dark water did not feel like I was risking my life. It felt like it was the only real choice I had left to make." Brooke lifted her gaze back to Biscayne Bay, moonlight reflected in her eyes. "But everything is different now. Now I have so much to protect. I have you and Marcus and Keith and this family. If I saw someone fall into the bay tonight, I would still go in after them. But this time would be different. It would be harder, because I would have to fight like hell to get back. Because now I have every reason to come back." Gianna smiled and gave Brooke's hand a gentle squeeze before she carried Marcus back into the house. Brooke stayed for another minute, taking a deep breath of the salty air, and then she headed downstairs. A shiny black car was parked at the main gate. Jace was leaning against it, his hands tucked in his pockets. As soon as he saw Brooke, he stood up straight and opened the passenger door for her. "Ready to go home?" he asked. Brooke glanced at the open car door, then looked back at the warm, glowing mansion. She could hear laughter floating out from an open window. Keith was waving at her. She could see Gianna rocking Marcus in the hall. Bruno and Nico were bickering about something completely unimportant. "Home," Brooke said with a smile, and she got into the car. Brooke's story is not a fairy tale. No Prince Charming came riding in on a white horse to rescue her. There was no fairy godmother who turned a pumpkin into a coach. There was just a woman who chose to live instead of giving up. A woman who decided to help someone instead of looking the other way, who chose to trust instead of being afraid. She did not find her family with the people who raised her. She did not find love in the place she thought was supposed to be safe. Instead, she found both right where she almost lost everything. And maybe that is how true families are really formed. Not from blood, and not from marriage certificates, but from a simple choice. From those single moments that change the course of your life. It can start by leaping into dark water for a stranger, only to find out that stranger will become the family you always needed. If you are not already a part of our community, please subscribe and click the notification bell so you never miss out on the incredible stories we share each day. We would really love to hear your thoughts on Brooke's journey. What part of her story connected with you? Have you ever faced a single choice that changed your entire future? Let us know what you think in the comments section. We look at every single one, and we truly want to hear about the stories that you carry with you. We want to wish every person watching this a life full of health, happiness, and peace. Always remember, you can never know how one small choice you make might completely change another person's world, and even your own. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in our next story. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.